Lynn Torrie, please introduce yourself and tell us where you're telling from, and please tell us a story.
Hello, everybody. I'm Lynn, and I am telling from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I'm going to tell you a story that comes from Zimbabwe. There are many different versions of this story, but this particular one was influenced a lot by the way an American Eshu Bumpus tells the story. It's called The Wax Child. There was once a girl who was alone. Now, she lived in a village full of many people, many children, many families, but they were not her people. She didn't know them and they didn't know her. And so they never invited her to play. And she would crouch in the door of her hut and she would peer out and she would watch sisters singing and clapping and dancing with sisters. And she would watch brothers leaping and jumping with brothers. And she would watch cousins playing with cousins. But she had no brothers or sisters or cousins. Now, she used to beg her mother, please, could I have a brother or a sister to play with? But her mother would only sigh and say, well, maybe at another time, but not now. Now, one day, her mother had been out gathering wild honey. And what they would do with the honey was they would boil it in a pot and they would skim off the beeswax. And as her mother was skimming the wax, the girl got an idea. She took some of that beeswax and she began to shape it. She began to shape it into a ball. And when it was about the size of an orange, she began to shape it more. She began to make it into a little head with eyes and a nose and ears. And when she had finished the head, she took more wax and she began to shape a body. And then she took more wax and she began to shape arms and legs. She worked till late into the evening with that wax. And when she was finished, she had made a little boy, a perfect little boy. And she looked at him and she cradled him. And that night, she put him at the end of her sleeping mat. And she went to sleep and she dreamt that he became real. And in the morning when she woke up, there he was. Her dream had come true. He was alive, walking across the hut with a big spoon towards the fire to stir the pot. No. And she ran and she stopped him and she pulled him back. She said, you cannot go near the fire. You're made of wax. You must stay back here with me. And so she kept him there, but the little boy kept creeping towards the door and she said, no, you can't go out into the sun. It's too dangerous for you. Stay inside with me. And so all day they stayed inside and she soothed him and she put him to sleep. And it was only when the sun set and it grew cool outside and the moon was high in the sky, then she let him go outside. And the two of them went out and they played together. They sang and they danced and they leapt and they jumped. And well, when they got too tired for that, they sat down and she told him stories. He loved those stories. And the stories he particularly wanted to hear were stories about the wide world. He wanted to know about the mountains. He wanted to know about the rivers. He wanted to know about the forests and everything all around him. And she told him everything. And this went on day after day, night after night. The girl and her little wax brother stayed inside during the day, and at night they would go out and they would play and they would tell stories. And that girl was such a wonderful storyteller that as she told, her voice carried. And the other children in the village started to hear those stories. And they were so wonderful that the children began to creep around closer and closer and closer so that they could hear those stories until every night when she went out to play, there was a crowd of children gathered to hear her stories. And in time, when she told her stories, they began to tell their stories back. And in time, they became friends. And one day the children said to her and the little wax boy, "Tomorrow, we are going to the river to have a picnic. Why don't you come with us?" And the girl was delighted, and the little wax boy was jumping up and down. But then she thought, no, we can't go out in the sun because my little brother is made of wax and he will melt. Well, they said, well, we can bring a blanket. We'll shield him from the sun. And the girl was nervous about this, but she was so excited by the chance to go out and play with the other children that finally she agreed. The next day, the children came and they brought a blanket and they covered the brother with this blanket to shield him from the sun. And together they all went down to the river. They had a wonderful time. The girl sang and she did clapping songs and she danced with the other girls. And the little wax boy, he just ran from one thing to the next. He couldn't believe it. The colors of the daytime were brighter and more rich than anything he could have imagined. He loved the way that the sun sparkled on the water. He loved everything that he saw, and he looked all around. And then he noticed something. He noticed that one little girl had drifted away from the other children. She was walking towards a patch of grass in the distance. And the little wax boy saw a movement in the grass. Something was moving towards her. Something large was moving towards her. And then suddenly he realized what it was. It was a leopard. And the little girl gave a scream. And all of the other children ran in the opposite direction. But the girl was frozen with fear. And the little wax boy didn't run away. He crept. No, he strode as quickly as he could towards the girl. He got closer and closer until he could see the whiskers of the leopard twitching. He could see the muscles in its back getting ready to pounce on the little girl. And just as it got ready to leap in the air, the wax boy took his blanket, he pulled it overhead, he flung it over top of the leopard, and then he got on top of the leopard and held that blanket down. Well, the leopard reared up and it began to thrash back and forth, trying to throw the wax boy off. And eventually it did. But by then the leopard was so frightened that it dashed off into the woods, trailing the blanket behind him. When it was quiet, the children began to creep back. They came back around the little girl, and when they were assured that she was safe, they began to look around for the little wax boy. But it was the height of the day. The sun was blazing down. And when they looked for the wax boy, all they could find was a puddle of wax on the ground. They looked towards his sister, expecting that she would be weeping because they knew how much the little brother meant to her. But she didn't cry. She just gathered up that wax. She gathered it into a big ball, and then she took it back to her house. And as the day went on, she began to shape the wax, and the children gathered round watching her. She made a head, but it wasn't like the head of her little brother. She made a body. She shaped wings and a long tail. And when it was finished, there in front of her was a beautiful bird. And she said, we must protect this bird from the sun. She asked the other children to go and gather leaves to make feathers that they could stick onto the bird to protect it. And they did. Every child came back with a handful of leaves, and soon the bird was covered with green feathers. They worked all night until that bird was finished. And in the morning, as the sun rose, it glowed pink on the bird. And the bird began to move. And the bird began to stretch its wings. and it stretched its wings out. And then it lifted itself right off the ground, and the bird began to fly over the children. It went round and round the village once, twice, 3 times, and then it gave a great cry and it soared off into the air, flew into the distance. And the little girl smiled because she saw that her wax brother was free to go on adventures on his own.
The emotion that you exuded in your telling was just absolutely contagious, and I just felt a lump coming up into my throat as I was listening to you. Thank you. That was a
Thank you.
beautifully done story.
Thank you very much. To me, it's a little bit of story about us as storytellers, that sometimes we start with our creativity almost to comfort us, but in times the creativity must eventually lead us to connection with others to be effective.
I think well said, Lynn. First of all, beautifully done. But yeah, I agree. I think it's that connection that we do uno al otro, one to another. Beautiful told story. Thank you. My heart
Thank
is
you.
filled.
Any other thoughts? Okay, well, thank you very much, Lynn.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.